Here's a quick feature. It's called the mask positioning. So I'll create a new solid and we'll add optical flares. So I'll choose Effect, Video Copilot, Optical Flares. Then we'll change the render mode to on transparent so that we can see our background. What I want to achieve is have a gleam run down the edge of my logo as my animation is completed. So how would I do that normally? Well, I would keyframe the position of my flare. I would move forward, animate it, forward, animate it. But it's not really that precise. You have some speed problems. And what if the logo was more complex rather than just a perfect circle? Well, forget doing it that way. Let's go ahead, take the pen tool and draw a shape that represents along the contours of your logo. So in this case, we just have a circle, but if you had a logo that you had to trace and do something a lot more intricate, no problem. Now you can close the mask or you can leave it open. So what I've done is added a mask to the optical flares layer. And then all you have to do is set the positioning mode to mask. And then you select the mask and the lens flare automatically runs along that path. So then we just animate the position. Maybe, have it start at a 0 brightness, turns up to a little bit, and then turns off. So we just add a quick little brightness keyframe, and we are done and done. And so this is the feature. It's called mask positioning, and it's a way to simplify complex animations in 2D. Hope you guys like it. One of the main ideas with optical flares is to create animation without keyframes. And that goes from dynamic triggering to automatic shimmering of certain elements. So here I have somewhat of a logo treatment, and as I animate through, you can see that the shimmer element kind of shimmers. So it's kind of a cool effect, and it's also quite simple to set up. So to control the animation of the shimmer elements, we go to the options and we have our lens flare. Now, if I hold down the mouse button, you can actually see the animation of the lens flare in the preview window. Now, I can click on an element like the shimmer here, and if I roll down here, we can see that the animation control is enabled and the speed is set to 60 and the amount to about 45. Now we can increase that and turn it up a lot, and if we click, you can see it's like a big energetic object or something like that. But the cool thing is it automatically animates. Now you can turn the speed of an animation object to 0, and if we click OK, we can control that with the animation evolution. So if we want to go ahead and animate the speed here or start it and stop it, we can do that simply by changing the evolution. So it's kind of a manual way to control it. Otherwise, using the animation control is an automatic way to add a little bit more life to static lens flares. Most of the shimmer and sparkle type objects have the automatic animation control, so check it out, have fun. One of the main features we knew we wanted to include was the ability to create anamorphic style lens flares. So if we take a look at the preset here, I'm going to move it around. And you can see I have these bright elements that only move horizontally. But if I move the lens flare up and down, they stay with the light. So this is a pretty simple idea, but not being able to do that with normal lens flares is a bit limiting. So if we take a look at a standard lens flare, you can see all of the elements stay in a perfect straight line along a single vector, and that's from the light source through the center of the frame. So elements can be further from the light source, but it will always be in a straight line. Well, real lens flares don't really follow that rule. In fact, even non-anamorphic lens flares commonly have elements that just sporadically show up in strange places. So if we just take a look at a couple examples here, this one was somewhat inspired by this image, and you can see that this is an anamorphic style flare. It is a preset that is available. Taking a look at this one, you have these different spots and these elements. Again, if we look at the Sun Digital, if we move this around, you can see that these blue elements only exist horizontally. And again, we have sort of a Michael Bay style lens flare where you have these objects that just move around the frame in a little bit less than linear way. So they're not necessarily all horizontal, but they can have some different variation. But these position controls aren't only for creating anamorphic lens flares, but putting elements into the frame where you want them. Now, if we look at this example, we have the real sun on the right, and we have the optical flare preset on the left. And the only way to be able to create this would be to offset the elements from the light position. And with optical flares, you can simply move elements up and over and anywhere that you want them. Let's go ahead and take a look at how we would set this up, because what's a feature unless it's really easy to use? So go into the options, and we already have a preset that's ready to go. So let's just clear it, start from scratch, and then we'll click on Lens Objects, and we'll add a glow, a multi-iris. And what I want to do is go to the multi-iris. We're going to come down to the object shape and change the polygon sides from 6 to 4. So that basically makes a square. Now I'm also going to turn down the roundness to 0. And the roundness just gives it a little bit of a round, more organic look. So we actually want that to be 0. We'll come up here to the top. I'm going to stretch my elements down. So we'll just stretch this so that it's kind of these smaller elements. Maybe scale them down also. Now, right now it's set to translate freely. So that means X and Y. And that would be okay, but we want to create an anamorphic element. So we go into the translation here and we just set it to horizontal. And automatically that element will only translate in the horizontal fashion. Now, what about adding another lens element? So we'll come over here, we'll click on Iris, and let's go ahead and make it anamorphic. Maybe we could do 2.4, nice and wide, and we can even cheat it and just kind of squeeze it down. We'll change the color of it to blue. And that looks good. Now, I want this element to move around, but I want to move around mostly horizontally. So if I change it to horizontal, it will always be horizontal. But what if we go down to custom? So custom starts out with 100% and 100%. So that means free translation, 100% in X and 100% in Y. So if we lower this value, we'll get something closer to horizontal, but not completely. So now we can move it, and that element will stay somewhat horizontally, but also translate a little bit less. Now, another common requirement is to offset an element from the light source. So we'll go back to this multi-iris, this horizontal multi-iris, and let's scale it down a bit, and maybe even squeeze it in, brighten it up. So these are the common settings for controlling most of the settings. We'll also lower the number of objects to about 10. So that's pretty cool. It's kind of like a digital kind of anamorphic flare. Basically, I want to offset the position from the light source. So we'll come over here to the offset, and we'll go ahead and maybe bring it down a bit. We'll duplicate the object, and we'll move it up. So we'll set this to -2. So now we've got 2 copies, and I always like to variate the second copy so it doesn't look exactly the same. Maybe add a couple more objects or something. And there we've got some anamorphic elements. We could come over here, add a streak, and maybe a multi-iris that does translate so that we have somewhat of a complete flare. We'll turn on the show background, and you know, it's not perfect, but it looks pretty good for a video demo. Here's a couple of different examples of anamorphic style presets available with optical flares. Another essential feature is the foreground obscuration. So what that is when you have a lens flare that goes behind an object and blinks out. So here we have an example of a 2D lens flare on this title, and what I want it to do is blink out as it goes behind it. So we go into the effects controls, is scroll down to foreground layers, and what we do is we set the layer to the source of what we want it to go behind. In this case, the title. So now the lens flare position will blink out as it goes behind that text. but we also have some control over that. First, we can sample the color, but we can also sample the method if we want to do an alpha or a luma invert. Another thing I want to do is make a copy of the optical flares. So I'll choose Edit, Duplicate, and then I'll go down into the effects, and I'm going to link the position of a second copy to the position of the first copy. So I'll use an expression. I'll Alt-click on the position X, Y, and then I will pick whip to the position of the top copy. So this is a common thing that you'll be doing when you want to make more complex scenarios. So I'm going to take the first copy, put it below the title, and then I'm going to shut the foreground off. I don't actually want it to blink out. So then if I take the top copy, move it, what you'll see is the main flare will go out, but we'll still have some stuff in the background. And then I like to go in and maybe make a few changes to the lens flare, maybe add a shimmer, maybe tweak some of the settings so that it's a little bit different. You can go into the global parameters and change the global random seed just to give it a few random changes so it doesn't look exactly the same. Then maybe turn the scale down, maybe turn the brightness down. And then as we move the first flare, it's as if there's volumetric light behind it as it's obscuring. So that's one cool example, but you can also do 3D obscuration. So if we take a look at another example here, we have a light moving across some layers, and you can see it's going behind them. Now, as I showed you before, it can also sample the color. So if I lower the opacity of these layers and then let the lens flare go behind them, you'll see the color of the lens flare changes to match that layer. So that's another cool feature. But let's take a look at this example. We have 3 solids, and I want to set this up from scratch. So I'm going to create a new solid. Choose OK. Then I'll choose Effect, Video Copilot, Optical Flares, and you can set it to render on transparent so that you get rid of the background. I like to leave it on black and change my transfer mode to screen. So to get it to work with the 3D lights, we just change the positioning mode from 2D to track lights. So instantly we have 3 flares on 3 lights, and if I scroll around, you can see it's 3D. But they're not obscuring behind the layers. So if we go into the foreground, we set up the 3 layers, first solid, second solid, third solid, and we input those into the foreground layers. Then the 3D position of the lights will then register so that those blink out when they get blocked. So if I hide that stuff, we can see it a little bit better. So there's our lens flare, kind of blinks out there. Now, if you're working with a 3D render, what you want to do is export a matte of a layer that you want to obscure, for example, the ball, and then optical flares can use that matte to obscure a light as it travels behind it. And that's how we use the foreground obscuration. The true power of optical flares lies in the customizable core objects. And those are the individual elements that make up our lens flares. Now, if we take a look at this lens flare here, you can see there's a lot going on. There's a sun in the background, and it looks really good. And you know why it looks really good? Is because this is actually a picture of a real lens flare. Now, I've recreated it using some of the elements from optical flares. So if we shut it off, we can see a similar lens flare, but this one can be controlled with an optical flare's position. Now, it has a lot of the same properties, a lot of the small details and offset, and it was all created procedurally using optical flares. In fact, now if we just take a quick look, you can see there's a ring, there's a caustic element, there's little spot irises, there's orbs, and some shimmer. So using all of the core elements, you're able to recreate realistic lens flares and also realize your own imaginative lens flares as well. So we'll hit OK. Let's take a look at a few other examples. So here we have this golden anamorphic flare, and you can see it's more inspired, but you have all these unique elements and anamorphic properties. If we just look at some of these other lens flares, these were all created with optical flares. And we have this Sun Digital, which has all those unique elements and the spots. We've got this blue sort of Michael Bay style lens flare. We've also got this Spotlight lens flare that was created using a few various effects. And there's really unlimited possibilities, especially when you have the position and translation controls to be able to move elements in and around the frame. So here's the sun that's based on this picture that looks almost identical. Now let's go and take a closer look at some of the objects in optical flares. So go to the options here, and I'll just go ahead and clear the preset there. And we'll come over to the lens objects, and here we have our 12 objects. But we also have custom objects. And a custom object is essentially a core object that's been modified. So if I add a glow and a multi-iris and maybe a streak, these are the core elements, and then we could go through and change the settings. But I can also go to the custom objects and add a few that are already prepared. So this one is kind of an interesting object, maybe an anamorphic spot and an anamorphic stripe, maybe a sparkle. It's kind of there to show you what the core objects are capable of creating. Now, while we have this up here, I want to show you the sparkle object. I think it's one of the coolest objects in optical flares because it really allows you to do some interesting things. So I'll just make some space here. Now, we have the common settings, and that's where we control the brightness and the scale and the rotation. And we can also come down and we play with the colorization. And then we have animation controls for some of the core objects. And then we have the sparkle controls. So we can control the complexity. We can make it, really simple or really complicated. We can change the length of the objects. We can change the spread amount. So if we turn the spread random down, it starts turning more into a circle object. And then maybe turn the thickness up, the complexity back up. Any of these settings can really give you some unique looks. And not only that, but we can play with the colorize. We can make it more gradients. We can just use a single color. A lot of possibilities. Now let's go through and take a look at some of the other key objects. And I'll go and clear it. Come over here. Go to the basic objects. We'll add our glow. Now the multi-iris is a really cool object too. So I'll scale it up. I'll brighten it up. And if we take a look at some of the settings, we have the spread, which allows you to spread the objects. You have a randomization so that they don't move the same speed. Move that down. You can turn up the number of objects. You have a scale and brightness randomization. And you can also change the random seed just to get something completely different. Now, we'll keep going through. The object shape is one of the key parts of optical flares for any of the iris elements. This is where you can change it from a polygon to a circle or use a texture image of a real iris element. Now, I'm going to go ahead and make a few less objects here. I'll turn up the scale and the brightness just so that we can see what's happening. And I'll come down here to the object shape. We're going to change it to a polygon. Now, the polygon has a lot of settings. You have the sides, so you can make it, a 3-sided, 4-sided, as many sides as you want. You can give it some softness. You can also turn up the roundness of the polygon so that it looks a little bit more organic. You can even turn it in to create somewhat of a star effect. We have this thing called blade notching. So if I scale this up, turn up the blade notching, you can see it kind of gives it an iris look where you have the iris blades overlapping. So that's just a cool feature just to add a little bit of subtle realism. We also have an outline intensity. So if we turn that up, it kind of creates a little bit of a border around the iris. And if you've seen any of the real iris elements, they sort of have that property, which just kind of gives a little bit of uniqueness. Now, another feature we have is the circular completion. But we'll take a look at that with another object perhaps. So I'll scale that down and we'll just go from there. Now, the next object we'll take a look at is the streak. Now, seems pretty straightforward. It's just a streak. You've got control over the position, scale, all those common properties. But the streak actually has some cool settings. So what if you want to create a star? Well, you replicate the streak. So if we turn up the replication copies to 2, now we've got somewhat of a star. And then we can go up to the common properties, maybe rotate it, and we're well on our way. Now, it can also do a few other cool things. So let's set it to an odd number, like 3. So it's created a similar star. We can, scale it down and, have a cool little object. And there's even some randomization to kind of give it a little bit less uniform look. But that is the streak element. We'll go ahead, we'll leave it there. We'll just turn it down a little bit so we can see some of this other stuff. So we'll come back over here. We have the shimmer and the glint. And these two objects are similar. The shimmer is more thicker, and the glint is more like thin lines. So you have lines that shoot out, and then you have more like light that shoots out. So you might use the glint for something, let's say we'll turn the thickness down, and it creates kind of a sharp sparkle, whereas the shimmer creates more like these God ray, type of an effect. So I like to mix them together just to add various detail. But let's just take a look at some of the various settings of, say, the glint for right now. So I'll scale it up so we can see it. So we have the complexity. So that's how many, detailed lines. You can control the length, the random length, so that they're not all exactly the same. You have the thickness and spacing random. So if we turn that up, you can start getting, some shimmery effects. And then we have the circular completion, which I guess we could take a look at right now. So right now it's set to 360. So let's change the lens flare, to a golden lens flare here. And I want to turn the completion down. So we'll just start moving it down. And so now we've basically limited the area of that object to 83 degrees. And we can also play with the feathering. So if I were to hide our streak, you can kind of see exactly what that's doing. Now, without the feathering, it would be a little too sharp. So we can have a little bit of feathering, maybe turn it into just a little sparkle off the bottom of the element. And all of the objects that would need it have this circular completion. It's really a powerful feature. And not only that, but you can control the auto rotation. So you can make it rotate towards the center so that the light always looks at the center and it almost sparkles as it moves around as well. Okay, moving on, we have a spike ball, which is just sort of a random burst of light. And we have control over a lot of the similar type properties, the thickness and the complexity. And this is a little bit more of a different look than the other two elements. And sometimes you just want to have kind of a random blast of light. We checked out the sparkle. We've got the ring, which is pretty cool, and it's a common thing that you'll see, and you can control circular completion, the thickness, and we can scale it up and change the feathering on the inside and the outside. And you can also change the color from spectrum to just a single color as well. So I'll close that out. Moving on, we have the hoop, which is a cool element, and the hoop has a lot of controls. You can make it continuous or you can make it liney. You can turn up the detail there. So you can kind of see the different looks that you can create. Again, you can change the color and the completion. So if we turn down the completion, we can just make it an object that shows up away from the light source. So kind of like an eclipse effect. But with that on, maybe back to continuous, and maybe we'll make it a blue color, and we can really do a lot of things with the hoop. And by default it's set to anamorphic, but we can set that to 1 to have sort of a perfect circle as well. Now moving on, we have our lens orbs, which simulates something that's out of focus on your lens and has a illumination radius, and you can control the size and create random seeds. You can even duplicate it, give it a random seed, scale the objects down really, really small, maybe turn up the number of objects. and almost create like a dirty lens effect. So I'd probably tweak the settings there, but that's the idea. Now, moving on to the last object, we have the procedural caustic element. And this is just a cool element to recreate the look of a light reflection. This is a basic introduction to the core objects, but there's really a lot of features inside of each of the objects that will give you the control you need to recreate any of the shapes and objects that you would see in a real lens flare. And if you can't, just use a texture because you can load it up just as easy. So those are the 12 core objects of optical flares. Let's go and take a more in-depth look into the preset browser. So we'll come over here, click on the Show Preset button, and the preset browser slides out, and here we have all of the folders with the various lens flares. Now, as noted before, the number next to the folder name is how many lens flares are inside that folder. So if we click on the folder, we can then start looking at the different lens flare presets. So to load them, we just click on them, can move them around, try them out, hit the space bar to come out, try some of the other ones. You know, there's subtle lens flares that, you know, might be for smaller lights or, you know, a really bright sun or something like that. So there's really a lot of variation. And what a lot of people might use it for is to just see different looks. And say you don't necessarily like this little blue element. Well, you can load the lens flare, scroll down in the object stack, find that object that you don't like, and hide it or even delete it. And you could either resave it as your own custom, you know, make some more changes, or just hit OK and use it. So we really wanted to make it easy to just get started and get going with optical flares right away. And you can use the navigation at the top here, or just click on the back folder. We can look at some of the other folder presets, and you can even save the preset into your own folder or create a new folder of your specific variations. Go ahead and hit cancel for now. Another cool feature with optical flares is the ability to load multiple lens flares. So let's just open up this blue one right here. It looks pretty good, but say I want to combine it with this subtle green one. If I right click, there's an option to add to current. Now if I just click on it, it will replace it. And I can undo that. But if I right click and choose add to current, then all of the objects then get added. So if you go through some of the different presets, you could really create a pretty complex, intricate lens flare by just combining various ones together. Now you might want to go through and, you know, delete some of the glow objects so that the lens flare doesn't get too bright. But it can be a creative way to create, you know, the ultimate lens flare, I imagine. Now, inside of the plugin folder is the optical flares presets. Now, we use our own preset files to store all of the different information, and you can go in there, click on the lens flare presets, and you can copy them, back them up, save them, even send them to your buddy who has optical flares, and they can load them into their project. So it's kind of a fun thing to do, and we also have the preset network where people can log in and share presets, which we'll talk about as soon as that comes out. Now remember, in addition to saving an entire preset, you can also save individual objects by right-clicking, choosing Save as a Custom Object, and then giving it a name, and then that will become available in the Lens Objects custom area. So kind of a cool way to just save off, you know, your individual elements that you really like and that you maybe want to reuse. The preset browser was designed to make it easy to try out different lens flare looks. So if I turn on the show background, here we have this futuristic scene created with the Cry engine. And if we come over here to the browser, we can click on some of the different presets and just try out different looks for our light. And it just kind of makes it cool to quickly go through, you know, see what works and what doesn't work without having to spend a lot of time loading presets or doing any of that. You can just instantly click on them, get an idea of whether or not that's working or not. So that's a good way to use it in combination with the show background feature. So Optical Flares has the flexibility to create your own unique custom lens flare or get started right away with some of the great presets that you can use right now. All right, well, if you made it this far, I am shocked, but there's a lot of features and I just want to try to get them all out there. Now let's take a look at some of the more technical benefits of Optical Flares. So first of all, Optical Flares renders in 32 bits per channel. So if we change our project file to 32 bits and we alt-click on it, now we're in 32 bits per channel. So if we roll over the bright area here and we look at the info palette right here, you can see that the brightness goes all the way up to 5, which is 5 times brighter than regular white. So if we added a box blur and turned it up, you can see that the hotspot in the middle of the flare is sort of overpowering the areas around it. Now, if I were to change back to 16 bits, you can see that the image gets more flat because it no longer has that data. So 32 bits per channel, for those who know, it's a great feature, and it sure makes sense to have it on a light-based plugin. Now, another cool thing is that Optical Flares is GPU supported. Now, you may not have a video card that supports it, but if you do, you're going to get some speed enhancements. And by the way, with the GPU, it also renders up to 32 bits per channel. So whether you're working in 8 bits or 32 bits, you're still going to get some speed improvements. So going down the list here, now Optical Flares has a few options for rendering. Now, say I made my solid accidentally, a different color than black. Well, usually you want to put a lens flare on black. So we have an option just automatically renders the lens flare on a black solid. Now we can set it to transparent and it'll render over an image that's underneath it. Or you can set it to render over the original image. So now we have the lens flare on our red solid. Now I like to render on black and then set my transfer mode to screen so that I can actually composite it. And the benefit is it's easier to color correct when it's on black than when it's on transparent. So just a quick tip. Now another cool feature is Optical Flares renders in custom views. So here we have some lens flares that are being obscured and we're in 3D space and I'm moving a camera around. But if we change it from the active camera to say the top view, we can actually see what our scene looks like and our lens flares render just so that you can see where the light is coming from. So here we actually have lights in those positions, and so it's kind of nice that it renders and it's aware of the custom views. There's some other advanced features that really help you out while you're working, and one of them is the ignore global parameters. So I can change the rotation, and you can see all of my objects rotate. But what if I don't want this star streak to rotate? So we'll go into the options, we'll scroll down to our streak element, and that's the one that's creating that star. And if we scroll down in the object editor, we have some advanced settings. And we can say ignore global rotation. We hit OK. And so then if you rotate it, it no longer rotates that object. And you'll also notice there's a few other properties like ignore 3D perspective and brightness and scale. Now the ignore 3D perspective, if we turn that on, hit OK. Now if we move the camera close to it or further away, you can see that that star element is staying the exact same size even though we're getting closer to it. And that comes in handy in a number of cases. Another cool feature is Optical Flares allows you to change the center pivot point. So instead of having to make your lens flare really large for a flare that renders outside, you can change the pivot point of where everything is looking at. And it's also useful for creating spotlight effects or just changing where things are. So that's kind of a cool feature, and all the flares work that way. And we probably already talked about this earlier, but we have a dynamic color picker which updates as you change the settings. And that's a cool feature, and it's not something that is automatic. We actually had to build it custom. Of course, if you want the old one, go to the preferences and say use After Effects Color Picker. And it's not live, but it is sadly familiar. So either way, you can get the best of both worlds, or just use ours. I don't know why you would use the other one, but it's probably someone that is out there thinking, man, If only I still had that old color picker, I could get this job done. Well, fret not, sir. We have you covered. All right, guys, this has been a pretty fun, pretty in-depth look at optical flares. The cool thing, it's very easy to use. You can start with a small flare and you can build up to a complex masterpiece. Well, I'm Andrew Kramer, and we'll see you next time.